to be probably our 6,000th Zoom during this time together. And I know it's been a while, but it still feels weird. So I'm appreciative that y'all are here and spending this time for this conversation today about creating a culture of care. I know Matt gave me a little bit of an introduction, but I'd like to share a little bit about myself with my own words. My name is Charles. I use he, him pronouns. And as mentioned, I'm a member of Lambda Phi Epsilon Asian Interest Fraternity. I crossed my organization in fall 2004 and served on my fraternity's international board for 10 years. And during that time, I was privileged to be able to serve as the national vice president and president for a total of 7 years. And for my day job, I do work at Northwestern, where I advise the Interfraternity Council, and I now do social justice education for the entire community. And I've been working as a professional in this field almost 8 years. Outside of credentials, I'd love to share that I'm a big fan of warm cookies. I love to dance, although these days that's mostly limited to my living room, but still fun. I love to write. I like to journal. I love to ask really deep ass questions and be in meaningful conversation with people. And I would share that my core value is radical love. And I am invested in and committed to cultivating radical love and healing and liberation, both in my own life, but for other people as well. So now that I've shared a little bit about myself with y'all, I'd also love to know just who's here with us in this conversation today. So if you're comfortable, I'd love for you to just check in the chat. And if you would share your name, your pronouns, if you'd like, your chapter affiliation, and then what is something that's been bringing you some joy this summer? In light of everything that's going on, where are you finding your joy? So if you want to drop that in the chat, I'd love to get a sense of who else is with us here today. Okay. Hey, Brandon. Hey, Keshar. Hope I'm saying that right. Lexi, Bailey, welcome. Hey, Kevin. Teaching our pet cat tricks. I love that. I wish we had time for that. Maybe we will. Golf. Lots of pets. Okay. Joanne with the ukulele. That's impressive. Damn, Michelle's out here making money. Good for you. I'm trying to be on that train too. Spontaneous beach trips. I'm about it. Okay. League of Legends. Got some runners in the group. Beach again. Yo, the beach is life-giving. Okay, cool. Well, welcome. Please continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. Happy to get to know you all and for you to be part of this conversation. We can start off by setting some context around why would it be helpful for us to be talking about a culture of care. And I think it's helpful to remember that we are experiencing a lot of unique and challenging and difficult circumstances right now. Most of y'all are aware that we are still in the midst of a whole ass pandemic, which I think most of us hoped would last through April. And here we are half a year later, still not knowing when the end to this is going to be. In addition to that, we have seen the continued murders of Black folks in our country. like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and we continue to see harm done to Black folks. I know that in the Asian Greek community, we've also seen some new waves of accountability with survivors coming forward to share their stories and ask for accountability in our communities. And on top of all that, Earth was like, hey, I see you're having a hard time. How about a hurricane and a tornado? You know, let's just keep it interesting. So it has stayed exciting this whole time. We've faced a bevy of really difficult, heavy hardships during this time. And the fact of the matter is that even before quarantine, life was hard. We had plenty of challenges or reasons to really need care and love in our lives. So I think this conversation is really apt right now, but I also want to affirm that we can also always be talking about care and love. Those are things that always need a presence in our lives. So to lay the foundation for this conversation, I want to start off by saying that culture, I think, can be a little bit heady, or it can feel a little bit intangible. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today are building blocks. We're going to talk about culture as really a culmination of a lot of small everyday actions that each of us can take that hopefully build towards a different culture in the Temple sorority and fraternity community. So to give a heads up of how our conversation is going to look like today, we're going to start off talking about self, and we're going to start off talking about self-care and how we understand that. And once we've kind of spent some time defining and better understanding self-care, we'll talk about some of the barriers that keep us from really engaging that in a meaningful way. And from there, we'll tie into self-love and maybe how that relates into this conversation as well. Once we've built some of that foundation, we'll talk a little bit about how do we start to do this work? How do we engage in that? And we'll wrap it up by talking a little bit about, from the individual, how do we also start to move into relationships? How do we move into the interpersonal work as well? A couple things that I want to start off by sharing as guidelines for this conversation is that I feel that I have valuable stories and knowledge to share with all of you, but I also really believe in the collective wisdom of this group. So I know that all of you also have wisdom and experiences and stories that are of value and can help us learn together. So I hope for this to be a conversational experience. I hope this to be a participatory experience. I really encourage y'all and invite y'all to use the chat function to make comments, to dialogue with one another, to ask questions. I'll be checking the chat box every now and then to see if there's questions to follow up on and see what I can respond to. And the other thing that I'll say is that a lot of our conversation today, I think, is going to be pretty vulnerable. We're going to go into some deep and intimate topics, and it's going to require some vulnerability and courage. And I'm really encouraging y'all to be willing to step into that and show up to the conversation. And I think that's how we're going to get the most out of this. So that's the conversation. I think we're ready. So let's get to it. Like I mentioned, the first place that I want to start is just talking a little bit about self-care. And I'd love to invite y'all in the chat to share some of your thoughts or understandings around what is self-care. And I'd also like you to think about these other two questions listed below that, which is, how does our society portray self-care? And when are you supposed to engage in self-care? So I'd love to know from the group, what are some of your impressions of self-care? And also specifically thinking about, how have you seen that portrayed in society? And when are we supposed to do self-care? Journaling, meditating, giving myself a break when I need it. I love the energy too. Journaling with an exclamation. That's the only way to journal, Lexi. Other thoughts? What is self-care? Okay, Taylor says doing things that make you feel good physically and mentally. I love that. Zaven says watching Shrek. I I'm supportive of that if that's what gets you what you need. Self-care is giving yourself love and making sure you're mentally stable. Also being kind to yourself no matter what's going on. Annie and Rachel, love that. Spot on. Self-care is personal growth and doing things to better yourself as a whole. That's great. Thanks, Lisa. Okay. Michelle says using face masks, so we're also thinking about other people and making sure to take time off. Yeah. Treating yourself, whatever helps you gain your balance within yourself. Watching Ratatouille, cool. I'm also a Pixar fan, so I support that. Lifting, putting yourself first, doing art, laughing. Yeah, thanks for that, Ryan. These are all some really amazing answers. So a couple of the things that I want us to be thinking about when we're thinking about self-care is that when we think of self-care, I often think that it's presented to us as treating ourselves, which I don't think is a bad thing, but I think we want to be wary of the consumerization of self-care. And sometimes self-care is presented to us as indulging in some cake or getting a massage for yourself or taking a salt bath, going on a shopping spree. And all of those things can be valid ways of self-care. And we also want to validate that self-care isn't something that we have to purchase or pay for to engage in. And self-care doesn't have to be just those things. The other thing that I do want to name when we're talking about self-care is that self-care is often compartmentalized in our conversations or in the way that we understand it. And I think when we think of self-care, it's often we get to engage in self-care when we have time, or we get to engage in self-care when we deserve it, or when we've made it through X really difficult project or experience. I hear students all the time say, I'll take care of myself at the end of this week, or after this midterm, or after the quarter. And more, you yourself just keep getting pushed back. And I think what I've noticed is that there's an acceptance from a lot of folks that parts of our lives, and often large parts of our lives, are just going to be really terrible. And we just got to survive it. We got to get through it so we can get to the self-care, so we can get to the cake or the massage or whatever else we needed. And I want us to really think about self-care not as just something that happens later or something that happens outside of our regular everyday life, but self-care is a way of life. Self-care is the entire life that we build. How do we build a life that we don't have to regularly escape from? Could I ask if someone would be willing to unmute themselves and read this out loud? And if you feel compelled, go ahead and just unmute yourself and do it.
Self-care is about making decisions in every single moment of our lives that honor and prioritize ourselves and our needs.
That was amazing. Thanks so much, Richard. So this is the framing that I want us to keep in mind when we're thinking about self-care, that it's not just something that we deserve at some points or after we've achieved something or when we have time, but self-care is in every single moment, in every decision. We deserve to think about ourselves and what we need. So that could be cake. That could be a shopping spree, but that could also mean developing a budget and feeling healthy about your financial situation. And I think this also means learning how to say no, I think it means doing less. I think it means ending a friendship with that toxic person in your life. I think it could mean setting boundaries, asking for help, telling people exactly what you need, resting, finding a new job that really fits what you want. That means sitting with your emotions. And it means making choices that mean that everyone won't like you. And some of those things might not feel great in the moment, but we are building toward a life that feels healthy, that feels aligned. And again, isn't one that we have to regularly escape from and binge self care because it's so difficult in the way that it's been designed. I think one of the things that's really exciting about self care now is that it's part of our regular everyday conversation. Lots of people are aware of self care as a concept and thinking about and hoping to engage in self care. And I think that's a really exciting part of our conversation today. And still, I think it can be really difficult for us to actually engage in self care. And I think we want to dig into why that is. So I'm going to ask y'all to help me populate a couple of lists as we're reflecting on this. And the first thing that I want to pose to all of y'all is this question that I am dropping in the chat box. I want us to think about what are the values of American society? What do people in a US context value? Okay. Money, 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 money. Status, power, money. These are great. Keep them coming. Success, unrealistic beauty. Spot on with that. Fame, patriotism, bread. I'm pretty sure that's the metaphorical bread. The American dream, absolutely. Influence, football. We do love our football. Freedom. Okay, perfect. That's great. Now I want us to do this one more time. And this time, we're going to zero in a little bit more to y'all's very specific context. And I want to pose the question again, but this time we're talking about the Temple sorority and fraternity community. And I'd love to know, what do you think is valued by the members of the sorority and fraternity community at Temple? Okay, loyalty, friendship, honesty, family, love that, diversity, leadership, authenticity, love that, responsibility, brotherhood and sisterhood, accountability, trust, Okay. Y'all have some good values out here. Perfect. Um, so I want people to take a look at these lists and, this is interesting, kind of how this panned out. I think there's definitely some differences between what we see as American values and how it seems that y'all have defined your own values at Temple, which I appreciate some of the difference that's here. I think one of the things that I want us to think about is where self-care and love are on these lists. Obviously, when we're comparing that with the first list, I think there's a lot of tension there. I think when we're thinking about Temple, I think there are some arguments to be made how self-care fits into different pieces of this. And also, it wasn't something that came up explicitly. And I think that we want to engage in self-care and there is an intent to move towards that. And I also want us to recognize that it's not something that's coming up regularly when we're thinking about what are the actual values of the community and what are people really spending time and energy and investment on. And especially when we're looking at a societal context, I think there's a ton of tension there with how are we possibly supposed to care for ourselves when we're also fixated on or told that we need to fixate on getting money, getting status, getting power, getting fame, getting influence, being individualistic. How do those things reconcile? The thing that I want us to really sit with here is to acknowledge that this is our reality, that these are the contexts and communities that we live in. And our society is constructed in a way that does not make self-care easy. And I think we can trace a lot of this back to systems of oppression. I think especially when we're looking at the American values, you can see threads of capitalism, individualism, you can see threads of patriarchy. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge how those things impact us on the individual and personal level. So in order to resist some of the things on here that we don't like or maybe don't feel entirely aligned with us, we have to think about how we relate individually into these systems. And when we're doing that, we want to talk about social identity. So I imagine many of y'all might have already done some identity work. If not, we'll do a quick recap. And when we're talking about social identities, we're talking about a person's sense of who they are based on their group membership. And group membership is understood by physical, social, and mental characteristics. So again, many of you might be familiar with a chart like this, but here we're looking at a number of the primary social identity groups and some of the different ways that people can identify within them. And why I'm sharing this with y'all is because our identities have meaning, whether that's defined by us or by others. And our identities also have implications for our relationship to power or lack thereof. And in all of that, our identities impact how we understand or have access to love and care. So depending on how you identify within your different social identities, that might impact whether self-care and love is blocked for you or limited to you in different ways, or whether the path is cleared or made easier for you to access some of those pieces. So I'm going to pose to y'all a reflection question to share. And that question is, what is one way in which your identities inform how you understand self-care? I'm going to give you all a moment to reflect on that and think about that. And if you feel compelled, I'd love for you to also share what you've come up with in the chat with the group. As y'all are working on that, I can give a few personal examples. I think one of the immediate ways that comes to mind is through my maleness. As a man, I've learned to be unemotional. I've learned to not be too loving. I've learned to have to do it on my own. And if I'm not aware of how I've learned my masculinity and spending time with that, how that shows up for me around self-care is that when I'm struggling or when I'm going through a wave of depression, I don't really know how to tell anyone. I really struggle to reach out and ask people for help. In my Koreanness, I grew up in Southern California and moved to the Midwest for grad school. And that was probably my first experience with some more blatant racism and experiencing people who had joking stereotypes for me. Or one of the most salient memories I have is of the older admin assistant in our office always joking that the office smelled a particular way because of food that I brought. And if I'm not naming my experiences around my Koreanness and ways that I've learned that Koreanness, then how that shows up for me around self-care is that maybe sometimes I'm not showing up with my fully authentic self. And maybe I hide parts of myself. Maybe I hide parts of my culture because of those experiences. And one last example I'll share is around body. I have spent a lot of time reflecting on all the messaging that I've received from people everywhere, from my parents to my friends to my fraternity brothers, who have commented on and had things to say about my body and my weight my entire life. And if I'm not thinking about that and spending time with the way that I've internalized that body shame, then how that shows up for me around self-care is when I've ended up working late and I know that the best thing for me to do is to go home and eat a good meal and get a great night's rest. Instead, I'll tell myself, no, you have to run. You are accountable to this because you need to burn X calories. You need to lose X amount of weight. So I hope that's helpful in illustrating how we internalize what we've learned from systems of oppression. And those things show up within us in the form of shame, as fear, as self-hate. And they are powerful forces that we need to be able to name and spend time with if we want to get closer to self-care. We as a collective need to continue to fight and dismantle systems of oppression. And we can also have a role in seeking our own healing and liberation. I'd love to ask again if there's someone who might be willing to read this out loud for the group. And again, if you feel compelled, please just unmute yourself and go ahead.
Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kareem. If y'all have thoughts or reactions, I'd love to invite you to share that in the chat. And before we talk about this quote a little bit more, I do want to center that Audre Lorde made this statement as a Black woman in the 80s who was asserting in the face of an oppressive society that she was worthy of care. And I think that context is important for us to know and also remember because of the ways that Black women and women of color continue to be marginalized even today. I think we can also be grateful to learn from the message and messages that she's sharing here. And what I want us to take away from this is that as we've been discussing, we can see that our society is not built in a way for us to care. And sometimes it doesn't even make it easy to live or survive. The systems in which our society is built on want us to be defined by our productivity, by our busyness, by our identities, and we're made to believe as though we couldn't be enough just as we are, that there's no possible way that we're enough. So when we're engaging in conversations on care and love, we need to recognize that that is counterculture, and we are working against a lot of powerful forces to try to actually be successful with that. So I know that might sound heavy and discouraging, but I want to affirm that it's absolutely possible to live in different ways. And getting a better sense of what we're up against lets us know how we can start to resist it. So next we're going to take part in a quick activity, and I'm going to ask you to find somewhere you can write. So if you have a pen and paper, that's going to be ideal. You can also type on your computer or device, and if anything, you can simply do this mentally in your head. And what I'm going to ask y'all to do is to write a list of what you love. And I'm going to give you 1 minute to do this activity. Okay, so again, you're writing a list of what you love, as much or as little as you want, and you're going to have a minute's worth of time to complete the activity. And I'm going to start your time now. So just a reminder that we're writing or reflecting on a list of what we love. What do you love? What comes to mind? Spend 30 seconds. Okay, and that is time. So I know many of you have your cameras off. I'm going to invite you just for the next minute, if you are comfortable, turning your cameras on, because this is going to be most meaningful if you can see other people who are in the room. And I promise after this minute, you are welcome to go back to no camera. Okay. So I'm gonna ask y'all to start by raising your hands and do it so it can be visible for other folks who are seeing you. And if you're not in gallery view, this is gonna be best if it's in gallery view. And I'm gonna ask you to keep your hand raised for as long as the following prompts relate to you. So for everyone who has their hand raised right now, I want you to keep your hand raised if in the list that you just wrote, you included yourself. Okay. Okay. I want you to keep your hand raised if you wrote yourself in the first 5 things or the first 5 things that you thought of. Okay. Still some of y'all? And let's go first 3 things. Okay, and first thing. Wow. Okay. Props to y'all. There's a few left standing. That's awesome. Okay, that's the extent of the camera time. So if you'd like to go back to camera off, you are welcome to, and we'll continue from there. So I'd love to know if there are reactions to that, to just give a 1-word reaction in the chat, something that you're feeling or thinking after experiencing that, or maybe seeing what happened from your other community members as well. When I did this some years ago, and legit, it was like some cheesy meme in like cursive writing, probably like plastered on like a mountain background or something like that. I had an experience that I think some of y'all might be having right now, in that the problem wasn't that I wasn't high enough on the list. The problem was that I wasn't on the list at all. I did not even think of myself. Of the dozen or 15 things that I came up with, myself was not even a consideration. And that was, honestly, that fucked me up. But it fucked me up in like probably the best way possible. And I'm not saying that you have to be at the top of this list, but I do want to affirm that I believe that everyone deserves to be on their list. And I do believe that all of us deserve to have some agency in where we want to fall on that list. And the takeaway that I want to offer to y'all here is that we can't talk about self-care without talking about self-love. Because you will not care for yourself if you do not love yourself, if you do not believe that you are worthy of that care. So even if self-care sounds like a good idea, even if you've created a really fantastic self-care plan, the fact of the matter is that we're constantly in moments of pressure or faced with a tough decision, or we're trying to care for everyone or everything else we just wrote on our list, or we're trying to resist every ism that we named earlier, or trying to live up to all of those values that y'all named that were American values and temple values. And after all of that, the question is, will we choose ourselves? And when? At what point? And what do your list tell you about the answer to those questions? So I know we've trended in kind of to a new direction, and I want to share that there are no easy answers here, and there's no easy work to move through self-love. And if you were hoping for some quick and easy steps, I'm just encouraging you to let that go. Because self-love is some of the most difficult and intimate and personal work you'll ever do. But that doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile. There are a couple of things that I can offer you towards this end. And the first one is to simply start here. And I think some of y'all might already have this swirling around in your head after the list activity that we just did. But I think I would love to encourage you to, if you've never done this before, in as bold and honest way as you can, to ask yourself and face yourself with this question of, do you love yourself? Do you radically love yourself? And I know that this can be a really hard question to face, and the answer might be even more painful to face. But the fact of the matter is that if you answer this question with anything that is not a resounding, full-throated yes, you are going to be left with the truth that will be impossible to ignore. 3 years ago, I got out of a long-term relationship, and my friend encouraged me to spend some time alone. And she encouraged me to do that for at least a year, which I thought, the fuck? Why would I do that? And spent some more time thinking about that and recognized that I hadn't been alone for a year for 14 years. And then I was like, okay, maybe there's some more fucked up psychological shit going on here. And I committed to spending time alone. And I very quickly realized that I had no idea how to do that, that I had no idea how to be alone. And that being alone was absolutely terrifying to me. Earlier on in this journey, I found a quote that really resonated with me, and it said, "You're never really lonely if you like the person that you're alone with." And putting even self-love aside, I think I realized that I was terrified of being alone because I didn't really like that person that I had to spend time with. And sometimes I even hated that person. But what came from that was that I knew that I did not want that to be my reality. So that was the beginning of a long experience dating your one and only myself. The work that's happened over the last few years has been some of the most painful that I've ever experienced. And it has been also the most transformative and liberating work I've ever done. And that brings me to my second offering to you, is that whether you are already on your journey to self-love or you are just beginning it, that's okay. And one of the ways that you can do that is to practice being in relationship with yourself. And I think this is important because you're not going to love something or someone that you don't know, that you are not invested in, that you haven't spent time with, that you don't have a relationship with. So to be in a relationship with yourself, that means to get to know yourself, to be curious about yourself, to be romantic with yourself, to be intentional with yourself. One of the ways in which we can start to build our relationship is to practice self-affirmation. And self-affirmation is our opportunity to recognize and affirm our own existence and our own worthiness. I'm going to invite you all to take a moment to create a self-affirmation statement for yourselves. And in thinking about this, I want you to consider what are some of the self-limiting things that you hear from others or that you tell yourself. And what are the things you need to hear to dispel that, to affirm your existence, your worthiness, your gifts? What do you need to hear? So I'm gonna ask y'all to reflect on that. And again, if y'all are comfortable, I'd love for you to share what you come up with in the chat group with the rest of everyone else. As y'all are working on that, I will share some examples. These are things that I write every day to myself in my journal, things that I need to hear, things that I need to tell myself. I am enough. I am worthy. I love myself. I love my body. I am non-negotiable. I am the fucking wilderness. I am the sun. My light cannot be silenced. I am still fucking here. Every moment with myself is a gift. I get to write my own story, and I choose a loving and liberating one. I root in a place of wholeness, of self-love, of compassion, of joy, of possibility. There is a story behind why every one of those lines exists. And those are things that I have to remind myself of regularly. I'm loving the shares in the chat. I radiate love. That's amazing. Yeah, these are really powerful. Thank you all for those who are feeling brave enough to share with the rest of the group. Yeah, I love it. Keep it coming. Please feel free to continue to share. Self-affirmation is just one of the ways in which we build those relationships with ourselves and work towards self-love, radical self-love. One thing that I do want to name when we're talking about self-work in the form of self-care and self-love is that I think there can often be a tension with how can we stop to take care of ourselves. There's so much harm. There's so much hate in the world. I need to show up for people in need. I need to show up for Black folks, for trans folks. I need to show up for immigrants. I need to show up for survivors. And I think all of that tension that we hold is valid for us to sit with and really reflect on how we utilize our time. And I also want to name that we're not going to be able to dismantle systems of oppression while also holding ourselves to the demanding standards that we learn from those systems that make no space for us as actual people. We will not succeed if we lose ourselves in the process. So there is a practicality to love and care. for the sustainability of movements we're in. But I also want to posit that these things are not mutually exclusive. In fact, I believe that they're deeply intertwined. And I really want to frame to all of you that when you engage in love and care, that is justice. Your love and care are justice. The systems at play depend on us not taking care of or loving ourselves. So when we decide to do that, when we decide to pause, when we decide to affirm our own worthiness, we resist all of those systems. I really want to affirm that when we do this work with ourselves, that is the work, the work. And the ways that I've learned to care for and love myself have radically shaped the ways that I show up for others and that I can engage in justice work. I want to clarify that I believe that there's a difference between attending to our needs and ignorance or opting out. I'm not encouraging us to not be part of all of the justice conversations that are happening. And I think it's important that we have lots of forms of resistance. I think it's important that we have protest and art, and we have new ways to learn and educate ourselves, and that we're able to have conversations on abolishment and reform and divestment, and to talk about accountability. And I also want to affirm that love and care are tools in that toolbox. So lastly, I know that we've really been emphasizing work that we can do with ourselves, but it's also important to think about relationships and how we connect with one another. And all we're going to do today around that is to talk about one question. And the most ordinary, everyday interaction that you have with every single person you see, which is this: how are you? Which I believe there are three socially acceptable answers to. You've got your classic good. If you're feeling dangerous, you might hit them with the great. But the one that I hear the most of these days, especially in a university context, is busy. When I ask people how they are, they most often reply with busy. I'm busy. I've been busy. I am so busy. If we want to build a culture of care, we have to be able to genuinely ask and know simply how the people around us are. And we have to practice also being able to share honestly ourselves. Dr. Omid Safi wrote that if we truly intend to care for one another in these moments, then we should replace the question of how are you with this: how is your heart? Does it make you feel a little uncomfortable? I think there is a bold care to this question that often takes people off guard. And every time I ask it to people, they are almost confused if it's the first time they've heard it. Like, how is my, what? How is your heart? When you hear that question, what does it tell you? To me, it says that the person asking that question cares. To me, it tells me that the person asking that question actually wants to know the answer. That question is not just a formality or something they feel that they have to do or is polite, but that they are actually making a moment of space for care. So if that question feels expert level, I would encourage the next step is to simply ask, how are you twice? I think that also accomplishes a similar effect of how are you? No, how are you really? And really letting people know that you want to know the answer, that you care to know the answer. I know this might feel elementary, and also it's something that I don't see very often at all. And if we're going to be having big picture conversations around culture of care, how do we start in the smallest moments that we share with each other every day? On the flip side of asking, I think the other part of this is really letting ourselves feel and be human. So I want to encourage you to practice not just responding with a reflex of good, how are you? But really pausing before you answer. And to practice actually asking yourself how you are. Anytime someone asks me how I am, they know it's going to be a conversation. Because I'm going to take a moment to be, well, how am I? And then I can tell them. This morning's actually been pretty hard. And I've been having some issues with my family, and that's making me feel really anxious. But I've also been really excited in preparing for this presentation. That was an actual answer. So I'd love to practice. And I'm going to invite y'all in the chat to answer this question from me. And I would love for you to not use the standard answers of good, great, or busy. And I'd love for you to check in with your human self and answer this question of how is your heart? And find a place on this wheel that feels right and affirming to you. And I'd love for you to share that in the chat. Content. Thanks, Annie. Depression. Thanks for sharing that, Samuel. Proud. Thanks, Taylor. Hopeful. Optimistic. Moved. Longing. I love the honesty. Shocked, anxious, confused, helpless. Can you imagine if a friend of yours answered your question of how are you with one of these words as opposed to busy or good, and what different conversation could arise from that opportunity? Culture is made in moments, in interactions, in choices, and even in just pausing for a moment and truly trying to see one another, I believe that we can shift culture. I know we talked about a lot today, so I want to kind of recap some of the main points that we shared. we started with talking about self-care and really framing that as a way of life and not something that's consumerized or compartmentalized, but in every moment we make space for ourselves and our needs. We also illustrated how our society is designed in ways that make this really difficult. And better knowing ourselves and our identities and how we've been impacted by society is going to help us get closer to the healing that we need and the self-care that we need. Next, we talked about if we do want to engage in self-care, then we have to love ourselves. We have to believe that we're worthy of that care, or else once we're pressed into a difficult decision, we're not going to choose ourselves. But we deserve to choose ourselves. The good news is that this is something we can work on. We can work on self-love by building a relationship and practicing that relationship with ourselves. And we also affirm that there is a tension between how we hold what we need compared to the work that we feel called to do with others. And that is an important and healthy tension for us to hold. And I also want to affirm that our love and care have space in that conversation, and that our love and care are forms of the work, are forms of justice. And lastly, we talked about how culture is a culmination of actions, and it can start simply with the questions we ask one another and the answers that we share with one another. I am hopeful that there's been something meaningful that you've taken from this to reflect on or to think about for yourself, or for the relationships you have, or the chapters or the sorority and fraternity community that you're a member of. And there is one last thing that I want to offer to all of you before we part ways. And that is with you, that I believe that you fucking deserve love. You fucking deserve love. You fucking deserve love. I want to wholeheartedly affirm that all of us were born worthy, and you remain worthy of love and care every day. I'm incredibly grateful for this time together. It's been so special to just share space with y'all, talking about honestly shit that I really like to talk about. So this has been fun for me too, and I appreciate that. Big thanks to Temple FSL for inviting me, and for all of y'all for spending time with me. If you'd like to stay in touch, I am happy to connect at my email here, which I've shared. But otherwise, I would like to send all my love and light to all of you, and I will hand it back to Matt.